Such a case has never occurred with investigators from South Dakota. There are 3 suspects, the husband, the lover, and the 12-year-old daughter, each with a motive for committing a heinous crime, but only one of them is guilty. Will the detectives be able to uncover the truth, navigating through the depths of anonymous letters, spy devices, and false evidence amidst the ocean of passions that unfolded around what seemed to be an ordinary American family? On the morning of Wednesday, February 8, 2006, Wyoming resident Bonnie Burns was sitting by the phone, eagerly awaiting a call from her daughter, 41-year-old Tami Reay, who lived in Pierre, South Dakota. Every morning for many years, Tami would call Bonnie without fail. The sudden silence from her daughter frightened Bonnie, so she decided to call herself. Tami's home phone went unanswered, and her mobile phone redirected the call to voicemail. She was also absent from her job in the shoe department at Kmart. Contemplating what to do next, Bonnie recalled the name of one of her daughter's colleagues, Brian. Tami had recently mentioned to the family that she had been communicating with Brian frequently. Therefore, Bonnie dialed the store number again, this time inquiring if Brian was present. Brian Clark answered Bonnie's call in surprise. He also didn't know where Tami was. However, in response to Bonnie's desire to contact the police, he asked her to provide him with the details. He dialed 911 and reported that he needed to report a missing person. Brian added that a crime may have occurred. When asked by the dispatcher why he believed so, he replied that he and Tami were having an affair, and it was evident that her husband had found out about it. When 12-year-old Haley Reay sat down to have breakfast, she immediately felt that something was off. Her father, Brad Reay, was also seated at the table, but her mother was nowhere to be found. Tami always busied herself in the kitchen, but now the house was unusually quiet. Haley walked into her mother's bedroom. All her belongings were still there. Her SUV was parked in the garage. The girl couldn't understand what was happening. Her mother couldn't have left without her purse, phone, or keys. They had spent the evening together, while her father, as usual, worked late, and her mother never once mentioned that she had plans in the morning. Perplexed about where she could be, Haley asked her father. In a hushed voice, Brad replied, "Sweetheart, she's probably with her boyfriend. She'll be back in 2 days." Tami and Brad met in Billings, Montana. The young couple started dating right away, and within a year, Tami was expecting a child. It was her dream to get married and become a mother. Tami took care of Haley and the household while Brad focused on his career. In 2004, Brad's hard work paid off when he was offered a promotion to assistant manager at Walmart, but it required the family to relocate to Pierre. Although it was the administrative center of South Dakota, the town had less than 14,000 residents and lacked any significant entertainment options. One notable attraction in Pierre was the dam and the adjacent lake, a popular spot for fishing and hunting. However, it provided a picturesque and peaceful setting for the family, so Brad accepted the offer. The move from a big city wasn't easy for the family, but after some time, life in the new place began to settle. Hay found a few sports clubs to join, and Tami found work at a store where she met Brian Clark. Unlike her husband, who loved his wife but couldn't devote enough attention due to work, Brian was always there for her. The news of her mother having a boyfriend came as a thunderbolt out of the blue for Haley. Although her parents had informed her 2 weeks earlier that they had decided to get divorced, this news caught her completely off guard. Her parents had explained to her that her father had been working incredibly long hours, sometimes up to 100 hours a week, and it had taken a toll on their marriage. However, they had promised to stay together until the end of the school year so that the changes wouldn't affect Haley's education. And now, with her father announcing that her mother had a boyfriend, Haley didn't know what to think. After dropping his daughter off at school, Brad headed to work. As soon as he entered, 2 police officers approached him. When Brad heard that his wife had gone missing, he was shocked. He explained that he hadn't seen Tami since the previous day. When he arrived home from work after 10 p.m., his daughter was already asleep and Tami wasn't home. Around 1 a.m., Brad heard a car screech to a halt outside. He glanced out the window and saw Tami park her black SUV, get into another car, and drive away with a man. Brad had recently discovered that his wife was seeing someone else and assumed it was his car. Succumbing to a sudden impulse, he got into Tami's SUV and followed them, but soon his wife's car broke down and Brad had to pull over on the side of the road. A passing patrol officer stopped to assist Brad. By the time the car started again, he had lost sight of his wife, so he returned home and went to sleep. The next morning, she was still missing, and he assumed she had gone somewhere with the other man. The detectives listened attentively to Brad's account of the events from the previous night. The store manager, a man of small stature and meek appearance, didn't seem like a threatening individual, and his behavior didn't indicate any signs of lying. The police asked if Tami could have already returned home, and Brad willingly agreed to accompany them. It was a trick. The officers had already been inside the house and one of them noticed something through the garage window that caught his attention. When Brad allowed them to search his home, one officer went inside while the other headed straight to the garage. There, he noticed a reddish-brown stain on Tami's car door. As he approached, he saw blood dripping from the vehicle's threshold. There was too much of it, and when the police officer opened the door, he was nearly overwhelmed by the powerful smell of bleach. Everything indicated a crime, but the officers didn't want to alarm Brad, who could demand the search to stop at any moment. The police decided to employ another trick. They asked Brad to drive with them to the station to answer some questions. And while the owner was not at home, they would request an official search warrant. Simultaneously, during the questioning of Brad, the police spoke with Haley. The girl shared that her parents never argued and her father devoted every spare moment to the family. That's why the news of their divorce was such a surprise. Haley noticed that the impending divorce had also taken a toll on her father. He had been very moody in recent days, hardly eating anything, and he had called Tami, pleading for her help in saving their marriage. Meanwhile, Haley's mother had behaved as usual. Tami told her family that the house would stay with her and Haley, and Brad would move out. The family confirmed the girl's words. Tami was looking forward to the divorce. She informed her relatives that the house would remain with her and Haley, and Brad would relocate. At the police station, Brad cooperated fully, answering all the questions. His wife had recently confessed to him that she had fallen in love with someone else and wanted a divorce, but Brad didn't know who the other person was. He adamantly denied any involvement in Tami's disappearance and insisted that he had no idea where she might be. When the detectives informed him about the blood found on the car, he was shocked. While Brad was being questioned, the police obtained a search warrant for his home and thoroughly examined every room, but everything seemed completely normal except for the blood in Tami's car. It was a cozy home of an ordinary family. The amount of blood found in Tami's SUV indicated that she had suffered serious harm and was likely killed. In such a case, Brad was the most likely suspect, given his wife's desire for a divorce, which provided a motive. They interrogated him for 5 hours until he insisted on having a lawyer. Although they weren't 100% certain that Tami had been killed, they couldn't release the suspect either, as he could potentially destroy any evidence. The police had no choice but to arrest Brad on the first-degree murder charge. While Brad Reay was under arrest, the investigators invited Brian Clark to the police station. He arrived with his lawyer. Just like Tami, Brian also had a family, a wife and a daughter. Brian told the detectives that he had last seen Tami the day before her disappearance. They met at a motel, and then Brian dropped Tami off at her home around 5 p.m. afterward. He went to a basketball game with his wife and daughter. He spent the entire evening and the night at home. Brian mentioned that his wife could confirm his alibi, but she was unaware of his affair with Tami, and he preferred it to stay that way. Once again, the detectives didn't know what to think. The man genuinely seemed concerned about Tami, but the fact that he immediately appeared with a lawyer raised suspicions. Additionally, The fact that Brian's wife was unaware of her husband's infidelity provided him with a motive for murder. Perhaps, if Tami had confessed to Brian, she demanded that her lover do the same, urging him to get a divorce or even threatening to talk to Brian's wife, pushing him over the edge. Access to Tami's SUV was in the hands of her husband, but if his story about surveilling his wife was true, Brian could have killed Tami and doused the car in blood to frame her husband. The police tracked down the patrol officer who had stopped to help Brad start his car, and he confirmed Brad's account word for word. Now, the police had confirmation of the story he had consistently repeated. So, who was the killer if the murder indeed took place? No matter how you look at it, without a body, the case couldn't progress any further. On February 9th, search teams began combing the extensive area around the city, where rarely anyone could be found except for hunters who frequented the hilly shores from October to January. If Tami was here, it was unlikely that anyone would stumble upon her before the start of the next hunting season, 8 months later. By that time, wild animals would most likely have discovered her remains first. The teams covered kilometer after kilometer, but the woman was nowhere to be found. As the sun approached the horizon, the helicopter pilot decided to fly over the isolated plain, approximately 16 kilometers north of the city, one more time. While flying over the marshland near the dam, he spotted Tami Reay's lifeless body. As it turned out, the woman had been stabbed at least 35 times. It felt as if the killer had unleashed immense fury upon her. It was an extremely brutal murder, but there was no blood around the body, indicating that the attack had taken place elsewhere. The officers found a t-shirt and 2 blood-stained gloves, but there was nothing that could provide clues to the identity of the killer. Neither the autopsy nor another search of the family's home yielded any results. The investigators had no choice but to interrogate Brian's wife. It presented an excellent opportunity for the betrayed woman to seek revenge, but she didn't take advantage of it. She confirmed that her husband was at home on the night of February 7th. However, despite the couple sleeping in the same bedroom, the woman suffered from back pain and often spent the night downstairs in a reclining chair. That was the case on the night of Tami's murder. Therefore, Brian could have slipped out of the house in the middle of the night without his wife knowing. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. Suddenly, the case took a completely unexpected turn. A letter was delivered to the office of the district attorney. It was written by one of Brian Clark's cousins. The man could no longer stay silent and wanted to unburden himself. According to the letter, Brian confessed that on Tuesday, February 7th, he met with Tami at the motel and they agreed to meet again later. Brian arrived at Tami's house late at night. They took 2 blankets and set off in Tami's SUV out of town. After spreading the blankets, Tami undressed, leaving only her t-shirt, and asked Brian to wear a condom, but he refused. Tami's persistence infuriated him. He attacked her, and they struggled for some time before Brian forcefully got what he wanted. However, during the assault, the condom remained inside Tami's body. In a fit of rage, Brian grabbed a knife and attacked Tami. After killing her, he wrapped her body in the blankets and placed it in the SUV. He then returned home and parked the car in the garage. Brian had to share everything with his brother, who helped him get rid of the evidence. Many of the facts listed in the letter were not known to the public. The anonymous author could only have learned them from the killer. But there was one hitch. The initial autopsy did not reveal any condom. To uncover the truth, another autopsy was conducted. Incredibly, upon re-examining the body, the pathologist discovered this crucial piece of evidence that had somehow been missed the first time. The discovery promised to provide the much-awaited clue that the investigators were hoping for. However, due to the time the condom had spent inside Tami's body, the DNA sample could not be used for comparison. What seemed like a promising piece of evidence raised even more questions. Whoever wrote the letter undoubtedly knew all the information about the murder, but there was still no physical evidence proving that Brian was the killer. Now the investigators understood what Brad was talking about during his initial interrogation. Even when it was unknown whether Tami was killed, he had said, "All this evidence points to me, but I hope there will be a body because there will be something that will exonerate me. Maybe DNA, something like that." Brad could only hope for such evidence if he himself planted it in an attempt to frame Brian. The question was, how did he obtain Brian's DNA? The investigators talked to Brian and learned that he often disposed of used condoms by throwing them out of the car window. It turned out that Brad had followed multiple lovers before. By tracking them, he discovered Brian's habit, which allowed him to devise a cunning plan to frame his rival. Of course, Brad couldn't have known that DNA would not be suitable for analysis if it remained in another person's body for a long time. The biggest problem remained that the investigators still didn't know where the murder took place. The police returned to the family's house for another search, hoping to find the slightest clue. In Brad's closet, an officer found something intriguing, a tiny digital recorder. When the detectives pressed the playback button, Tami's voice filled the room. She asked to call Brian Clark. They spoke for a few minutes, and then Tami said, "I love you very, very much." Since the beginning of the investigation, Brad had claimed that he didn't know who Tami was seeing. But on the recording, Brian's name was clearly heard. Brad had set a trap to find out who his wife was meeting. He had placed the recorder in her car, along with a bouquet and a note. As Brad had hoped, Tami assumed the flowers were from her lover and called Brian to thank him, inadvertently revealing his identity. Now the police wanted to know what else Brad might have been lying about and how he managed to send an anonymous letter while being in prison. Brad regularly communicated with his twin brother, Brett Reay. When Brett was released from prison after a visit to his brother, the police were already following him. Upon his arrest, they discovered a very interesting notepad in his possession. It listed all the facts that later appeared in the anonymous letter. Additionally, they found a letter from Brad describing excellent fishing spots. He drew a map indicating several locations near the dam. Considering the murder charges against him, it was unlikely that he would be thinking about something as trivial as fishing. The marked locations were significant for another reason. Following the instructions, the officers found 3 large black garbage bags containing blood-soaked beddings. The bags also contained blood-stained rubber gloves, women's underwear, and a large tarp. The tarp explained why there was no trace of blood in the Reay family's house. Here's how events likely unfolded on that night. Brad had prearranged the tarp on Tami's mattress and placed several sheets over it to ensure she wouldn't notice anything. When she lay down on the bed on the night of February 7th, Brad entered the room and attacked her, stabbing her multiple times through the sheets and slashing her throat. The bedding immediately absorbed all the blood. Brad then carried Tami's wrapped body, along with the sheets, to the garage, located right next to her bedroom. He placed her body in the car, planted the evidence, and loaded her body and the bags of bedding. As for Brad's story about breaking down on the road and interacting with the patrol officer, he was likely on the verge of getting caught. He was heading to Brian's house, intending to plant some evidence, confident that the condom would lead investigators to his rival. And when he realized that he wasn't discovered during the autopsy, he had to devise a plan involving the letter with a false confession and seek his brother's help to send it. The trial began in January 2007. Since the prosecutor did not seek the death penalty for Brad, in the event of a guilty verdict under South Dakota law, he would automatically receive a life sentence. The prosecutor expected the process to be brief and clear-cut, but Brad made the rare decision for a defendant to testify in his own defense. No one could have anticipated what he would say when he took the witness stand. Unable to hide the lie any longer, Brad felt that he had to confess everything. It was not him who killed Tami, but his now 13-year-old daughter, Haley. Problems started after Haley was informed that her parents were getting divorced. She was furious because her parents didn't want to reconcile and spent whole days in a saddened state. On the night of February 7th, Brad returned late from work, and his wife and daughter were already asleep. He also went to bed but was awakened by the cat around midnight. Brad heard some noise coming from Tami's room and went to check what was happening. To his horror, he saw Haley standing over her mother's body. She was covered in blood and holding a knife. There was blood coming from her nose, indicating that Tami must have fought back. Brad shouted, asking Haley what she had done, but she stood motionless and didn't respond. Brad attempted to help his wife but realized it was futile. His daughter continued to stand there, showing no emotions. It was only then that Brad realized she was asleep. In panic, he took the girl back to her room and wiped off all the blood. He then tried to clean the crime scene. He put the clothes in the washing machine and took his wife to the car. To protect his daughter, he decided to frame a man whom Tami had seen. When Haley woke up the next day, she behaved completely normally, and Brad realized that she didn't remember anything that had happened. Initially, he wanted to escape to Mexico with his daughter, but he was arrested before he could do so. Brad explained that his daughter always had behavioral problems and had even stabbed her stuffed toys when she was a little child. He admitted that he had broken the law and deserved punishment, but only for trying to protect his child. The prosecutor was pleased that Brad provided testimony because attempting to accuse his daughter would have enraged the jury members. In reality, the evidence indicated that the wounds on Tami's body could not have been inflicted by a 12-year-old girl, even considering that she was a fairly strong volleyball player. During the cross-examination, the defendant couldn't explain facts that had already been reliably established. Moreover, Brad's twin brother had already confessed to everything. It took the jury 3 hours to deliver a guilty verdict. Nevertheless, Brad Reay insists on his story. He unsuccessfully filed an appeal, claiming that he was framed by investigators and that his daughter's DNA was never compared to the DNA at the crime scene. The most terrifying part is that if a condom with Brian Clark's DNA had been found during the initial autopsy, this case could have ended completely differently. The fact that the intended evidence was not found compelled Brad to bury himself deeper, acting out of desperation. Haley Reay lost both of her parents on the day her father decided to kill her mother. She moved to live with relatives in Wyoming and never saw Brad again. Fortunately, she didn't allow the incident to break her. The immense love that surrounded her mother became a source of motivation for the girl. Speaking out on public platforms, she became the voice of domestic violence victims who can no longer stand up for themselves. Haley pursued an education in criminal law, got married, became a mother, and only regrets that her son will never know what a wonderful, kind, and loving person his grandmother was. Pierre Mumnai and Cassandre Bouvier became friends in Paris while studying at the Sorbonne. The girls were passionate about the cultures of other countries, especially Latin America, so they studied the history, social and political movements, and culture of the region. Pierre, who was born in Morocco, was 24 years old. After completing her thesis on Argentina, she decided to put aside her books and visit the country she had written about. Cassandra, at the age of 29, was no stranger to traveling the world, so she gladly accepted her friend's invitation. The girls packed their suitcases and embarked on a journey through the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean basin. In July 2011, the friends arrived in Salta. It is a province located in the northwest of Argentina with a very interesting geographical, social, and historical repertoire. The landscapes ranged from snow-capped peaks in the Western Plains with a tropical dry climate in the east. The architecture includes churches and cathedrals built during the colonial period, ideal for exploration and study by curious students. However, it is worth noting that, like many provinces in the north of the country and probably throughout Latin America, Salta maintains conservative customs. The influence of the Catholic Church on people's daily lives is significant, and the differences between social classes are pronounced. Politics is controlled by a few influential families who have held power for decades. It is important to mention that as this story unfolds, things will become clearer shortly. On July 15th, Cassandra and Horia checked into a hotel in Salta and set out to explore the sites without unpacking their belongings, as they planned to return to Buenos Aires. Salta is a popular province among tourists, known for its low crime rate and friendly population, especially towards tourists. The main attraction in Salta is the natural reserve called Quebrada de San Lorenzo. At exactly 16:23 on July 15th, the girls purchased tickets to visit the reserve. They decided not to hire a guide and ventured deep into the forest. From Buenos Aires, they were supposed to contact their families and inform them of the next city they planned to visit. However, no word was heard from them. On the 19th, unable to bear the uncertainty, their families reached out to Cassandra and Juria's acquaintances in Argentina and asked them to contact the police. 2 weeks later, a group of tourists from a neighboring town embarked on the same trail as the French girls. They arrived at the reserve quite late in the evening, but it was not unusual in this area. Around 1800 hours, one of the tourists separated from the group to find a secluded spot in the dense undergrowth. There, he noticed something resembling a body. Approaching and confirming that it was indeed a body, he screamed and rushed back to the group to inform them of his discovery. The police arrived at the reserve around 10 p.m. The tourists had not marked the exact location where they found the body, only mentioning that it was near a viewpoint. Therefore, in the darkness and amidst the dense vegetation, the police initially struggled to locate it. Eventually, they found the body, but before they could begin their work, they discovered 2 more victims just a few meters away. It turned out to be the 2 missing French tourists. The police developed several theories, including the possibility that the girls were accidentally shot by a local hunter, as many residents in the area hunt for food. Therefore, the search focused on local residents. The police arrested Francisco Tejeda, who worked as a horseback riding guide for tourists. However, he was released just a few days later as there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. His wife told the press that her husband was arrested solely because they were poor people. The police needed a scapegoat to appease public opinion. Immediately after the discovery of the bodies, the police shared with the press that they had been lying in the forest for about 3 days. Since the girls had kept their tickets to the reserve for the 15th, various theories arose about what could have happened to them during the remaining days when they were reported missing. It was speculated that they might have been kidnapped, held captive somewhere, and then disposed of. However, the police later clarified that the girls were killed 14 days prior, and they had been lying in the reserve near the viewpoint all that time. Due to Cassandra's torn clothing and Yuria's pants and underwear being pulled down to her knees, speculations about violence against the girls emerged. The autopsy confirmed this. The tourists were severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot with a .22 caliber firearm. In the reserve, the police found a corresponding shell casing. They concluded that the girls had managed to take a walk and returned to the entrance of the reserve. There were few visitors at that time, the sun was setting, and the weather was not conducive to late walks. Obviously, it was then that the perpetrator or perpetrators approached their victims, with one attacker assaulting Cassandra. After the violence inflicted upon her, the girl was shot in the head while kneeling before her killer. Yuria, who witnessed Cassandra's murder, decided not to give up too easily. A clump of hair remained in her clenched fist, indicating her struggle with at least one assailant. Then, according to investigators' assumptions, the girl dashed down the slope from the height when she was caught by a bullet. It hit her in the back, passing through her shoulder. The culprits left, believing that Yuria was also finished. However, she was still alive and attempted to crawl back to the trail. Nevertheless, her attempts were unsuccessful as she was too weak and endured several more hours of agony before succumbing to blood loss. The investigators examined the girls' hotel room and found only one phone among their belongings, instead of the expected 2. By determining the location of Yuria's phone, they discovered that a local girl named Maria Fernanda Canizares, the daughter of a former police officer, was using it. They also found Yuria's camera in her possession. The girl claimed that these were gifts from her boyfriend, Gustavo Lossi. Gustavo, 23 years old, worked as a guide in the reserve, and his father sold tickets to tourists. It was Gustavo who had offered his services to the French girls, but they declined. Gustavo had changed the SIM card in the phone, thinking that would be enough to avoid detection. Not immediately, but Gustavo Lossi confessed to being present at the crime scene and participating in the violence. However, he claimed that he was not the instigator or the killer of the French girls, but merely a witness. He recounted that upon hearing noise and running to the screams, he witnessed two men, 24-year-old Daniel Vilt, a stonemason, and 31-year-old Santos Clemente Vera, a gardener from the San Lorenzo plain, tormenting the girls. Supposedly, these men coerced him into participating in the violence and then allowed him to leave. However, he didn't forget to take the girls' phone and camera with him. However, during a search of Gustavo's home, the police discovered the weapon that fired the fatal shots. Uriah's camera helped the police establish the exact time of the attack on the French girls. The girls were enjoying sightseeing and took several photos just before embarking on a hike through the reserve. 2 hours and 5 minutes later, at 6:28 p.m., the tourists took their last photo, which turned out blurry and unclear, allowing investigators to speculate that the attack occurred precisely at that moment. All three men were charged with murder. Witnesses immediately came forward, pointing to Vilt as the person who attempted to sell a rifle. However, he had a solid alibi as he was at a bank during the time of the attack and could prove it. In 2014, Gustavo Lossi was sentenced for 30 years in prison, while Vera was released due to insufficient evidence and his denial of guilt. He also claimed to have an alibi. However, the prosecutor demanded a review of the case, and in 2016, both men were sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed that one of the most high-profile cases in Argentine history had reached its conclusion. But no, the story doesn't end there. French journalist Jean-Charles Chattard dedicated 4 years to his own investigation of this case and wrote a book presenting his arguments as to why the girls couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve on July 15, as the investigators claim. The journalist is convinced that the girls didn't die in the reserve, their bodies were simply brought there after the murder. Firstly, even after a short walk in the reserve, his shoes were covered in dust and dirt, unlike the victim's shoes. The girls couldn't have taken such a path, then endured violence, fought for their lives, and still had clean shoes. Secondly, the appearance of the tourists, in general, was strange. Their clothing was more suited for an evening event in the city rather than a hike in the nature reserve. The next strange thing is that the bodies lay in Quebrada de San Lorenzo for 2 weeks. The reserve is a wild, open area inhabited by pumas, foxes, and condors. After such a period, the police could have found completely gnawed bones. However, the bodies were discovered without a single bite mark. Not to mention that they were lying in a popular reserve near a frequently visited viewpoint. Finally, the pathologist who examined the bodies confidently stated that they were killed 3 to a maximum of 5 days before the autopsy. Regarding the date of the murders, the doctor is categorical and indicated in the report that it was July 26, 2011. Remarkably, the judge who led the investigation changed this date to July 15th. Could it be possible that the judge intentionally manipulated the facts to protect someone? Could the judge intentionally tamper with evidence? Was he trying to protect someone? This is exactly what Nestor Piccolo, the commissioner in charge of the investigation, was convinced of, and it may have cost him his life. Commissioner Piccolo died under mysterious circumstances 4 months after the start of the investigation. He was found at the entrance of the commissioner's office with a bullet in his head. His mother stated that it was her son's decision, but she is certain that he was killed, and it was an execution. No traces of gunpowder were found on Nestor's hands, and before his death, he was working on a new version. According to Clemente Vera, he is innocent, and Gustavo Lossi is simply an accomplice of the real criminals, representatives of the upper classes of the province. Nicholas's investigation worried many people who wanted to hide the truth, including the judge. and the influential local families could not allow the light to be shed on the deaths of the French girls. However, this conspiracy of silence was interrupted in April 2014 by an anonymous letter describing the same trail that Commissioner Piccolo was investigating. The letter was sent to the victims' families in France. Chattard received a copy of it and pursued this lead. The anonymous letter was handwritten by a woman who chose not to sign it out of fear of testifying in court. Chattard spent several months, but eventually found a witness. It turned out to be a girl who is often in the company of a small circle of influential individuals in Salta. She knew that on July 15, 2011, the two tourists couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve because they were invited to a party organized by the city's wealthy youth. She paints a completely different picture of what happened. At such parties, alcohol flows freely and everything resembles a movie, but it's all happening in real life. According to the girl, Cassandra and Uriah were among the guests and were seen near the pool. As the evening progressed and more drinks were consumed, the men became increasingly interested in the attractive French women. Around 3 a.m., they led them inside the house, and no one saw them after that. The guys started harassing one of the tourists. Of course, she refused, but her opinion no longer mattered to the men, and things went too far. Her friend witnessed what happened, so the guys decided to kill both of them to prevent the truth from being revealed. However, they didn't rush. They tortured the victims for several days before finally killing them. The witness provided the exact location where this supposedly happened, a villa in the most fashionable district of the city, Buena Vista, where deputies, ministers, and wealthy foreigners reside. The villa is usually not occupied permanently as it is often rented out for private parties. There is also a pool, which is where the French women were last seen. But the most intriguing part is the villa's location, right beneath where the bodies were found. Behind the house, there is a hidden path leading to the lookout point of the nature reserve. If everything happened as the witness claims, the bodies of the girls were carried under the cover of night, taken through that path, and left in the dense undergrowth of the reserve. However, how could such a wild scenario, unfolding at a party in plain sight, remain a secret for so long? The witness claims that it can be explained by the terror imposed by the real criminals on anyone who dares to speak up. According to her, the party was organized by the son of a deputy who attacked the French woman. When she tried to escape, he severely beat her. 2 other sons of the politician were also involved in the assault and later in the murder. Today, the deputy's face calmly looks down from numerous billboards during his latest election campaign. By the way, one of his sons followed in his father's footsteps and became a politician as well. The politician refused to comment on these allegations, but one judge who presided over the initial investigation showed a great interest in the story described in the anonymous letter. He believes that it contains everything necessary to achieve justice. However, the judge who took over the case afterward had no intention of seeking other culprits. He believes that the family must be very influential to manipulate the police, and he attributes the deaths of the French women to the provincial justice system. The new version gives more weight to the witness's story, according to which he saw the 2 French women leaving the nature reserve on July 15. This means that the crime could have occurred in a different place and at a different time than what the investigators insist on. As for the blurred photographs supposedly taken during the attack in the nature reserve, Cassandra's father, Jean-Michel Bouvier, submitted the photo to an expert who believes that it has been manipulated using a photo editing program. The angle of the shot and the lighting cannot be as depicted in the photograph. In France, the victims' families no longer expect anything from the justice system. Jean-Michel Bouvier conducted an independent DNA analysis on his daughter's body. DNA from Gustavo Lossi and 2 other male individuals, as well as 1 female DNA, were found on the most intimate parts. There was no trace of Clemente Vieira's sample. The ownership of the other samples remains unknown, raising questions about the identities of the other individuals involved in the attack on the girls and the true role of Gustavo Lossi. Meanwhile, in the heart of San Lorenzo, A few hundred meters from the place where Cassandra and Uriah's bodies were found, there still stands the modest home of Clemente Vera's parents. After their son's arrest, they struggle to make ends meet as they are unable to work the land or care for animals in their advanced age. Clemente's parents, his wife, and many local residents believe in his innocence. They believe that his only fault is living close to the crime scene and not having the means to afford lawyers. It is especially sad considering that nothing in the case files connects him to the crime. He claims that the police beat him, that threatened him and his child, demanding a confession to the murder. When he refused to comply, they ransacked his house in search of any incriminating evidence, but they were unsuccessful. In connection with this, in 2017, Santos Clemente Vera filed a complaint with the Supreme Court of Argentina, and in June 2020, he was granted permission for a case review. He hopes that a new trial will be conducted, during which he will be acquitted. Interestingly, Cassandra's father is convinced of his innocence. He witnessed all the hearings, traveled to Argentina multiple times to learn the details of the case, and conducted his own investigation, concluding that Vera did not commit the crime. Therefore, he visited Vera in prison, apologized to him, and then started a social media campaign for his release. Bouvier is concerned that the case review is taking an endlessly long time, while an innocent person continues to sit in prison in Salta. On November 25, 2013, on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a monument was solemnly unveiled in memory of Cassandra and Uriah. Alfredo Garzon, a sculptor from Salta who lived in Paris, responded to Jean-Michel Bouvier's request to take on this work. By depicting an outstretched hand, eyes, and the face with an anguished expression, Alfredo managed to create a very powerful image conveying the pain, horror, and suffering that the girls went through. The sculpture is located in the San Lorenzo ravine, where the victims' bodies were found. On March 5, 2018, the medical staff at a hospital in San Diego, California, was awaiting the arrival of a 28-year-old patient named Brigida. She was being transported by an ambulance from her family doctor's office. On that day, Brigida called her mother, Olga, complaining of feeling unwell. Olga struggled to get her into the car. Brigida could barely breathe, and her legs trembled with excruciating pain. With just one look at the once vibrant and healthy young woman, the family doctor knew that Brigida was in critical condition and there was nothing he could do for her. Therefore, he called an ambulance to take her to the clinic. The emergency department medics were also alarmed that they might not be able to stabilize the patient's condition. Brigida was in unbearable pain, could hardly see anything, could barely speak, and had no sensation in her feet or hands. But the most puzzling symptom was that her once beautiful chestnut hair was falling out in clumps. The doctors began their work. They quickly determined that there were no external signs of trauma on her body. No bruises, wounds, or indications of infection. The cause of her illness was internal. Brigida's mother explained that her daughter had been suffering from sudden episodes of nausea, fatigue, and excruciating pain for several months. The symptoms would occur suddenly without any warning, causing her to spend days in bed. Brigida could barely take care of herself, let alone her husband and young son. Various specialists she consulted were at a loss, unable to understand what was afflicting her. Her symptoms did not match any known illness. One doctor even told her that her case was how critical days manifest. Finally, the doctors concluded that it was a result of stress and prescribed her tranquilizers. However, her condition worsened, her body was failing, and the medical staff in the emergency department of San Diego understood that if they didn't figure out what was wrong with her as soon as possible, the patient could die within days. Brigida grew up in California, just a few kilometers away from the border with Mexico. Her father worked at the customs between Mexico and the United States, while her mother took care of their two daughters, Brigida and her younger sister Olga. The girls grew up in a loving and caring family. Brigida happily attended a Catholic school, excelling in her studies. Her friends described her as the friendliest and kindest girl they knew. Brigida had a passion for running and even participated in competitions representing her school. It was through running that she met her future husband, Race Remington Uto. They met in high school. Race attended a different school but was also passionate about sports. At first, Brigida's family didn't pay much attention to their friendship because their daughter wasn't interested in dating boys. Her time was consumed by studying and sports. However, gradually, the young couple became more and more involved with each other and started dating. Race managed to bring out a more adventurous side of Brigida, and soon they became inseparable. Race had a highly ambitious goal. He dreamt of attending the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The acceptance rate for students was less than 8%, making it a challenging task. The applicant had to excel in school, work on personal development, engage in sports, participate in community life, engage in volunteer work, and much more. Surprisingly, Race managed to gain admission to the academy, and he moved to Maryland to begin his education. The young couple continued their relationship long distance. However, after some time, Race was diagnosed with a hernia that didn't resolve completely. He had to leave the academy but found work as an electrician in the Navy. Meanwhile, Brigida pursued her own plans and became a teacher. In 2014, after 7 years of being together, 25-year-old Brigida and 24-year-old Race got married. Soon after, they welcomed their son. Brigida believed she was perfectly happy with everything in her life going according to plan. She had a loving, caring husband, a wonderful child, and lived just steps away from her parents. However, her life would soon take an extraordinary and painful turn that she could never have imagined. Among the emergency department physicians at San Diego Hospital, there was a certified toxicologist named Dr. Jeff LaPointe, which was considered rare. He was a true medical detective, and like an excellent detective, LaPointe followed the trail of clues that could lead him to understand what was happening to Bridget. Was she being killed by an autoimmune disease? No, blood tests did not confirm that. Could she be suffering from cancer? No, although one symptom stood out among all others. Hair loss was not due to the disease, but rather a result of therapy. All the symptoms indicated that Bridget had been exposed to a toxic chemical. But which one and how? Was it arsenic, cadmium, or cesium? No, because these heavy metals wouldn't result in hair loss. However, there was one substance that could: thallium. In the early 20th century, thallium was used as a depilatory agent. It was also actively utilized by doctors. For example, if a child had head lice, thallium was applied to their head, causing the lice to fall off along with all the hair. In subsequent years, thallium became the main component of rodent poisons. However, by the 1970s, its popularity as a murder weapon, alongside arsenic, had increased to the point where it was banned for sale and use. All of Bridget's symptoms, including leg pain, weakness, deteriorating vision, loss of appetite, weight loss, and, of course, hair loss, indicated thallium poisoning. The problem was that Dr. LaPointe couldn't confirm his suspicions quickly. Nobody in the hospital had encountered such a case before, and there was no way to test the patient for poisoning. The samples had to be sent to another laboratory, and the results would be available in 3 days. 3 days that Bridget might not have. The race against time had begun. LaPointe started calling all the agencies, requesting an expedited analysis. But even if the doctor's suspicions proved to be correct and Bridget was suffering from thallium poisoning, the antidote would be urgently needed. However, obtaining the antidote, poetically named Berlin Blue, turned out to be more challenging than he could ever imagine. We have all seen Berlin Blue because it is a blue pigment used in paints. Vincent van Gogh used it when painting Starry Night over the Rhone. This substance is also an antidote for poisoning by certain heavy metals, accelerating their elimination from the body. However, while you can buy blue paint at the nearest art supply store, obtaining medical-grade Berlin blue is almost unrealistic. Lapointe called all the pharmacies, naval medical officers, clinics, but he found the antidote only at one warehouse, a classified warehouse in Los Angeles. The thing is, Berlin blue is also an antidote for radiation exposure, such as in the case of a dirty bomb explosion. Therefore, the government keeps meticulous records of every tube of Berlin blue in the country. And Dr. Lapointe couldn't count on getting the antidote until thallium poisoning was confirmed in the laboratory. When the toxicological analysis of Bridget's case arrived, Lapointe's worst fears were confirmed. The level of thallium in Bridget's body exceeded the permissible limit by 1,000 times. A hospital staff member drove all night to bring the antidote to San Diego. However, the doctor feared that with such a severe poisoning, one antidote might not be sufficient. He prescribed dialysis for the patient to cleanse her blood. It was a slow and painful process, and now all the medical staff and Bridget's family could do was wait and pray. Meanwhile, Bridget's husband and son were placed in another wing of the hospital to monitor their health. If she had been exposed to thallium, they could have been affected too. The main question remained, where could she have obtained such a large quantity of thallium? And the answer to that was being sought by FBI agents. It should be understood that all this was happening in a state with several military bases. Furthermore, these events unfolded against the backdrop of President Trump's planned visit. Therefore, when Dr. Lapointe started looking for Berlin blue, the FBI agents became very interested in what was happening in the city. FBI agents and police have discovered that several months ago, Bridget underwent treatment at an alternative medicine clinic in Mexico when she began experiencing an unexplained illness. The police investigated this lead but ultimately dismissed it. The school where Bridget taught was a former military base during World War II, where rodent poisoning could have occurred in the past. In that year, many teachers at the school fell ill. However, this lead also turned out to be a dead end. Investigators could not dismiss the possibility that Bridget had used thallium herself as a cry for attention due to her depression. But everyone who knew her claimed that she loved life and would never abandon her son. Furthermore, her depression emerged after the appearance of unexplained symptoms, not the other way around. Dr. Lapointe had his own suspicions about how his patient had been poisoned. He conducted a scan of Bridget's internal organs and was horrified to discover numerous white spots throughout her digestive tract. It became evident that the poison was entering her body through food. Someone close to her had attempted the perfect crime. Dr. Lapointe ordered complete isolation for the patient, allowing no one to visit her or provide her with food except what was provided by the hospital. However, at that moment, food was the least of her concerns. Bridget regained consciousness thanks to the antidote after a few days. All her hair had fallen out, and she couldn't sit or move, but she was alive. She couldn't name anyone who would wish her harm. However, the police knew that poisoning is always a personal crime committed by a close friend or family member. It was also interesting that Bridget's husband and child were unharmed. The police spoke with her sister, parents, and husband, all of whom were eager to help with the investigation. Ray wept and lamented that he couldn't switch places with his wife to relieve her suffering. He said what the detectives wanted to hear, yet investigators sensed falsehood in his words. The medical staff also noted that he didn't seem as concerned and asked strange and sometimes inappropriate questions. Response to the suspicion regarding her husband's involvement, Bridget became angered and vehemently denied it. She insisted that Ray had been caring for her when she was unwell, taking care of their son and bringing her to the hospital. Furthermore, he would prepare meals when she lacked the strength to get out of bed. However, during the conversation with Bridget, the investigators learned something that sent chills down their spines. Ray had a rather unusual hobby. He enjoyed collecting rare seeds of poisonous plants. This piqued the police's interest, and after 16 days of Bridget's hospitalization, the police gathered enough evidence to search their home. Ray opened the door and appeared somewhat agitated. The detectives asked him to hand over all the family's gadgets, and he willingly surrendered all the phones and laptops. However, he couldn't help but notice that all the search histories on the devices had recently been cleared. Despite the supposedly deleted data on his phone, the police found 2 books in Ray's mobile, Criminal Poisoning and The Poisoner's Handbook. According to the Poisoner's Handbook, thallium gives the poisoner the ability to control how quickly their victim dies. The poisoning presents itself as a medical enigma, with the patient slowly deteriorating for unknown reasons. There were even more intriguing discoveries. In Ray's car, they found a canister of acetone and a packet of exotic seeds hidden in a small compartment in the spare tire. Additionally, Bridget's sister handed over a black garbage bag that she retrieved from the trash bin, as their mother noticed Ray throwing it away just before the police arrived. Inside were receipts for exotic seeds such as tick seed, crea nut, and Cerbera odolum, along with various tools for their filtration and grinding. In other words, everything necessary for the production of rare poisons. It was evident that the man had already attempted to crush tick seeds to obtain ricin, a poison toxic to mice but dangerous to humans if inhaled or ingested. The detectives' suspicions grew, but there were no traces of thallium found in the house, garage, or car. Therefore, there was no basis for arresting Ray. All they could do was share their suspicions with Bridget and ask her not to return home. She still couldn't believe their words, but she didn't object to the continuation of the investigation. The investigators continued to dig deeper and discover the possible motive for the murder. Ray had a lover who believed he was a widower. He lied to her, claiming to be a Navy SEAL and expressing his goal to work for the FBI in the poisoning division. He didn't hesitate to bring his young son on their dates, and the boy had grown so attached to the woman that he called her mom. Leading a double life, Ray went even further and started another affair, confessing to the woman that he was married. However, he hoped that his wife would be hit by a bus, so he wouldn't have to share custody of their son. It's unclear why this didn't alarm the woman. Nonetheless, it was clear that the man wanted to end his relationship with Bridget. But as a devout Catholic, she had warned him before their marriage that she did not believe in divorce and that if they married, it would be for life. She could hardly have expected her unfaithful husband to take this ending so literally. The detectives asked Ray to undergo a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. When the polygraph examiner informed him of the results, he didn't attempt to deny it and confessed to everything. Race stated that he ordered thallium online 3 times. In August 2017, he first attempted to add it to his wife's food by preparing her a sandwich for breakfast. He calculated the amount of thallium based on her weight. The next day, Bridget felt unwell, but it didn't kill her. She started to recover. In December of the same year, Race added a slightly larger amount of thallium to the soup. Again, he didn't achieve the desired effect. In January, he increased the dosage 5-fold and once again hid the poison in a sandwich. He intended to kill Bridget within days. She felt terrible, experienced excruciating pain, and began losing her hair, but she continued to fight for her life. After confessing, Race was arrested. 8 months later, he pleaded guilty to 3 attempts to murder his wife. His lawyer tried to argue that Race suffered a spinal injury while serving in the Navy, and the pain clouded his judgment. However, this defense did not help. On March 14, 2019, he was sentenced to 3 life imprisonments ranging from 21 years to life. He may be eligible for parole in October 2033. If he is lucky and succeeds in his first attempt at freedom, he will serve only 14 years in prison and become a free man before his 42nd birthday. During the trial, Bridget was finally able to address her husband personally. She said, "I wanted to believe that I knew the man I married 3 years ago, the man I had been dating for nearly 10 years. I wanted to believe that he would never harm me. I am horrified by the thought that he could be responsible for attempting to kill me. How could you do this to the mother of your child? Why do you think you have the right to decide that I am not a worthy mother for your son? How could you decide that the way to end our marriage is by slowly killing your wife, watching her suffer for months? I cared for you and I loved you. Every time Bridget recalls the incident, she breaks into a cold sweat. She felt unwell and was lying in bed. Her husband brought her a sandwich with peanut butter. Their little son climbed onto the bed and asked for a bit. Race immediately shouted at her not to give him any. Bridget doesn't know if there was thallium in that sandwich, but she believes her son was at least on the brink of severe poisoning. Despite Bridget's reluctance to admit divorce, she eventually divorced Race. She still suffers from constant fatigue, weakness in her legs, and nerve damage. However, she is gradually recovering and has returned to work at a school for children with special needs. She admits that now it is much easier for her to find an approach to each student. Bridget, who once couldn't walk, is now running again, trying skydiving, and striving to live life to the fullest. The story of Tim and Charlene's meeting resembled a romantic fairy tale. Two intelligent, attractive, and successful young individuals were ready for marriage and, upon meeting each other, immediately understood that their union was meant to be. Over the course of 3 years, they tied the knot, moved into their own home, and welcomed a little daughter into their lives. However, after the arrival of their child, money became tight for the family, so Tim and Charlene decided to sell their beloved pickup truck and buy a simpler car. In May 2013, Charlene posted an online ad, and now she nervously paced the room of her house. Tim had been gone for over an hour, and she was starting to panic. Even if the men had decided to take the car for a test drive, they had been gone for too long. Charlene called her husband multiple times, but all the calls went to voicemail. He hadn't responded to her messages. Although she knew for certain that Tim had charged his phone before leaving for work, when he still hadn't returned late into the night, Charlene called the police to report her husband's disappearance. The Hamilton police took the disappearance of the 32-year-old man very seriously. Canine search teams and search and rescue teams were deployed, not to mention the hundreds of Ancaster residents who joined in the search efforts. Despite the community's involvement in the search, many suspected that the man had simply run away, possibly due to a disillusioned life or accumulated debts. However, the detectives found no evidence to support these theories. The police organized a press conference where Charlene directly addressed the abductors, pleading for them to release Tim and emphasizing the need for their little daughter to have her father and for her a husband. Barely holding back tears, she added, "It was just a car, just a silly car." It was only when Charlene uttered those words that everyone realized, all at once, that the car was the very reason for the man's disappearance. And thus, anyone could become a victim simply because they decided to sell their pickup truck. 3 days later, Tim's phone was found. It was discovered by a worker in the grass near a construction site, approximately 20 minutes away from Hamilton. However, there was no sign of Tim or his pickup truck nearby. The discovery of the phone itself was not significant since the police had already obtained all the necessary information from the telecommunications company. Detectives started investigating the phone number from which potential buyers of the pickup truck had called Tim. It turned out that the phone was registered under a false name and address. But Tim was not the only one listed in the outgoing calls. The persistence of the criminal who had used the number multiple times led the police to Igor Tumenenko, an Israeli army veteran who was selling a similar Dodge Ram and had posted an advertisement online. Igor told investigators that he had taken a test drive with 2 men just 2 days before Tim's disappearance, but unlike Tim, Igor had returned home after the drive. Perhaps it was because Igor was a tall, robust former soldier who could resist attackers if necessary. But most importantly, Igor provided the investigators with a description of the men, mentioning that the tall guy had a small bag slung over his shoulder and a tattoo on his wrist that read ambition. During the subsequent press conference, The police shared the description of the two men with journalists, and within 2 days, colleagues from Toronto contacted them, claiming to know exactly who the Hamilton police were looking for. They identified the wanted man as a young millionaire, playboy, and one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, 27-year-old Dylan Millard. Long before the police took an interest in him, Dylan Millard was a young prodigy. At the age of 14, he made headlines as the youngest Canadian to pilot a helicopter and an airplane on the same day. Born in 1985 to Wayne and Madeline Millard, Dylan was the heir to the multi-million-dollar airline company Millard Air, founded by his grandfather. However, by the time he turned 20, the guy dropped out of university and led a rather idle lifestyle. Dylan threw poolside parties, drove the most luxurious cars, and was always surrounded by glamorous women. He allowed his friends to live in his numerous houses and apartments, and he moved so frequently that some of the household staff never even met him. 2 months before the events described, his father unexpectedly passed away, leaving Dylan as the inheritor of the family fortune. According to his friends' estimates, it ranged from $10 to $20 million. It was hard to believe that a millionaire with a garage full of luxurious cars would be capable of kidnapping someone over a pickup truck. The police put Dylan under surveillance and discovered that he was friends with an employee of the airline named Mark Smick. Unlike Dylan, Mark did not come from wealthy parents. In fact, he made a living by selling illicit substances. However, what was of greater importance to the police was the extensive list of criminal offenses associated with Mark. At the same time, by comparing the footage from several surveillance cameras, the investigators pieced together the events of that evening. Shortly after the pickup truck left Tim's house, a dark SUV can be seen closely following it in the video. Dylan was behind the wheel of one vehicle, while Mark was driving the other. It cannot be stated with certainty, but Tim was likely already dead. Half an hour later, the cars stopped, and the criminals changed the license plates of Tim's pickup truck to avoid police detection. Now that they had obtained the desired pickup, their next task was to get rid of its owner. At 2 a.m., they arrived at the Millard Air hangar. The pickup was towing a large trailer with some heavy equipment on it. Mark and Dylan entered the hangar, and soon sparks and flames started to emerge from the equipment on the trailer. This mysterious fire would burn throughout the night. Early in the morning, when Tim had been missing for 12 hours, Millard Air employees received a message from Dylan instructing them to stay away from the hangar. Arthur Jennings, an employee of Millard Air, recalls that the demand was explained to him as company policy. On Tuesday, he obediently avoided entering the hangar, but on Wednesday, he came across a pickup truck identical to the one described in the news. The man didn't know what to do. Deciding to photograph the vehicle and its identification number, he dialed the anonymous crime reporting hotline and requested it to be checked. They confirmed that it was the same vehicle. The man was so shocked that he felt physically ill. Fearing for himself and his family's lives, he only reported what he had learned on Friday. By that time, the pickup truck was no longer in the hangar. Fortunately, thanks to the phone data and Igor's testimony, the police already had a suspect. On May 11th, 4 days after Tim's disappearance, Dylan was arrested by the Hamilton police. Charlene was relieved, thinking that her husband would now be found quickly. She didn't know that the police no longer expected to find him alive. Acting on a tip from neighbors, officers arrived at Dylan's mother's house, where they discovered the pickup truck in a large trailer on the driveway. The pickup had been partially dismantled and meticulously cleaned, but despite that, they found Dylan's fingerprints and traces of blood inside. The keys to the pickup are still hanging on Dylan's keychain. But what about the equipment that the pickup was towing that night? The police searched all of Dylan's apartments and homes. On his farm, they found an industrial incinerator for burning various types of waste. This huge furnace was the very equipment from which sparks of flame was seen on the night of Tim's disappearance. Inside the furnace, forensic experts found small bone fragments, including human teeth. Due to the intensity of the fire, obtaining DNA was impossible. However, it is presumed that the bones belonged to Tim, and on May 14th, the police officially announced his death. Astounded by their findings, the investigators wondered if there could be other victims among Dellen's acquaintances. They continued to search Dellen's farm, but by that time the Toronto police had already missed 3 crucial clues, each of which could have saved Tim. The first was the mysterious disappearance of 23-year-old aspiring actress Laura Babcock. By the time arrests were made in connection with Tim's murder, Laura was already missing for about a year. She had met Dellen at a pub in Toronto. They dated for no more than a month, after which they remained friends, although romantic encounters still occurred. In 2010, Laura met Sean Lerner. Sean was a complete opposite of Dellen, and he was clearly in love with Laura. Although their relationship ended after 18 months, they remained friends. After graduating from college, Laura had difficulty getting her life together. She was depressed, had arguments with her parents over their house rules, and found herself practically homeless, staying with friends. To make ends meet, Laura turned to the escort industry. Upon learning about her friend's difficulties, Sean paid for a motel room where Laura could stay with her pet and provided her with an iPad to search for more conventional work. It was Sean Lerner who organized a party for Laura's 22nd birthday, inviting Dellen and his future girlfriend, Christina Nuga, among others. Clearly, it was this love triangle that led to the tragedy. Laura continued seeing Dellen behind Christina's back, but Christina likely suspected something, and on Laura's 23rd birthday, she sent her a message saying, "Happy birthday." It has been exactly a year since Dellen and I became intimate. Laura immediately retaliated, saying, "Great, and I was with him 2 weeks ago." This message genuinely upset Christina about her boyfriend's infidelity. Dellen had to assure her that he would deal with Laura, promising Christina, "First, I'll hurt her, then I'll make her leave. I'll remove her from our lives." On July 3rd, 2012, Laura went home to her parents and left her dog, suitcase with belongings, and a shoebox containing approximately $1,000 in cash. She then went to the subway station, where Dellen picked her up and drove her to his home. At 7:03, Laura made a call to check her voicemail, and her phone connected to a tower near Dellen's home. After that, her phone stopped working completely. At 7:30, Dellen informed Mark that he was on a mission and would return in an hour. The next day, Laura's iPad was connected to Dellen's computer, and its name was changed to Mark's iPad. Afterward, Dellen took a picture of an object wrapped in blue tarp. In light of the events that unfolded, the photo speaks for itself. Dellen asked a worker from his aviation company to build a massive furnace for him, but when that experiment failed, he ordered a waste incinerator. On July 23rd, he sent a message to Mark stating that the barbecue was hot and ready for meat. Dellen's internet search history during that time revealed his interest in the effective temperature for cremation. Finally, he took a photo of Mark with the pipe from the incinerator and filmed the flames erupting from it. On July 14th, Laura's family and Sean Lerner reported her disappearance to the police, but upon learning about her recent mental state and profession, the officers didn't pursue her case, assuming she would return on her own. However, Sean refused to let the matter rest. He obtained a printout of Laura's recent calls and conducted his own investigation. It didn't take him long to discover that the last 8 calls from her phone were made to Dellen Millard. Sean called Dellen, who initially ignored the calls but eventually agreed to meet him and discuss the situation. Dellen claimed that Laura had asked him for illicit substances but didn't receive them. He then told Sean not to hope to see her again. Sean relayed all the information he had gathered to the police, presenting them with Dellen Millard's name on a silver platter. However, The detectives once again refused to take any action. Laura's case was forgotten, but a year later, when Sean heard about Dellen's arrest for murder, he quickly connected the dots and convinced Laura's family to call the Hamilton police. Unlike their counterparts in Toronto, the Hamilton officers showed great interest in their story. After the arrest of the men, Laura's iPad and her sports bag with her name and address written by her hand were found at Mark's house. In addition to incriminating photos on the iPad, investigators found a video in which Mark raps and essentially confesses to burning the girl's body and throwing her phone into the river.
Outside the home, and if you go swimming, you can find the phone.
Laura was still considered missing in November 2012 when the Toronto police missed two crucial leads. They were of a slightly different nature, but equally important to the case. An online advertisement for a motorcycle appeared, and just a few days later, its owner, Marty McDougall, came home to find that both the motorcycle and its trailer were gone. He knew that there was a surveillance camera right across the road that could help identify the thieves. Marty contacted the police, and an officer came and took the camera footage. However, despite Marty's persistent attempts to reach the investigator, he heard nothing from the police. It wasn't until several months later, after Tim's murder, that the Hamilton police contacted Marty, having discovered the stripped motorcycle and trailer. Where were they? In Millard's aviation hangar. This raises the question of why the police didn't use the footage to track Millard months earlier and save Tim. The third crucial lead that the police missed was the sudden demise of Wayne Millard, Dellen's father. After speaking with family members and colleagues, the police discovered that Wayne had threatened to cut off the funding for his son's extravagant lifestyle. Dellen was spending enormous sums of money and showed little interest in the family business. Wayne didn't want his son to destroy the fruits of his family's hard work and was planning to put an end to it, but he didn't get the chance. Wayne was found in his bedroom, deceased. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and a revolver was found nearby. Initially, the case seemed obvious to the police. However, now that the detectives knew about Dellen, they wanted to re-examine the facts. At that time, he was not considered a suspect, although it's unclear why investigators didn't pay closer attention to his behavior. He appeared too calm, relaxed, and gave very strange answers to questions. However, when a relative passes away and someone needs to identify the body, if someone asked when was the last time they saw that person, nobody would answer, 5 minutes ago to the coroner. No, a person would recall the last time they saw their relative alive. The reason for this is that most people don't want to think about death. When answering such a question, the brain automatically goes back to a previous, more positive moment. But the problem with Dellen is that the murder brought him pleasure, so when asked about the last time he saw Wayne, he immediately thought about the body. One more important detail, Wayne was cremated, but his hands were tested for gunshot residue and none was found. In combination with the odd behavior of the millionaire's son and the apparent financial benefit for the heir, it's strange that the police quickly closed the case. As for the family's friends and journalists, they were informed that the man died from a brain aneurysm. Since they didn't know the true cause of his death, no one suspected anything. Otherwise, they would likely have demanded a thorough investigation. When the detectives finally took up the case after Dellen and Mark's arrest, it wasn't difficult for them to discover that the revolver from which the bullet was fired had been purchased by Dellen prior to Laura Babcock's disappearance, and his DNA was found on it. Initially, Dellen claimed that he stayed at Mark's house before returning home around 6 p.m. and finding his father. However, phone records showed that he was at home from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., precisely during Wayne's time of death. It's as if the accumulating evidence against the two was not enough. Dellen secretly passed 65 letters to Christine from prison, instructing her on what statements she should give. He ordered her to destroy all the letters immediately after reading them, but she did not comply. During the trial, Dellen and Mark almost confessed to the murder, shifting blame onto each other. However, in this case, It didn't matter who pulled the trigger. Both accomplices were found guilty of the murders of Tim and Laura and were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Dylan received a similar punishment for his father's murder. The judge ruled that they would serve their sentences consecutively, meaning Dylan would have to spend 75 years in prison before he could even be eligible for parole. This is the maximum sentence ever imposed in the history of Ontario. Dylan's girlfriend, Christina Nuga, pleaded guilty to obstructing justice in relation to Tim's death. She revealed that she transported a car trailer and an incinerator to dispose of the evidence. The 24-year-old received a lenient punishment due to her testimony against Dylan and spent 3 months in prison. She later moved to Poland, where she attended medical school. The remains of Laura and Tim were never identified, but it is highly likely that they were found in the incinerator. Dylan Millard grew up in an affluent family and could have had everything he wanted. However, it turned out that what he wanted was to become a criminal. Just 2 years after meeting Mark, they started going on what they called night missions, stealing cars and motorcycles, not for profit, but for the thrill of it. They often burned them on the side of the road or destroyed them in an aircraft hangar. Once considered one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, he officially transformed into a serial killer, accused of murdering his father, former girlfriend, and an unknown person in less than a year. But if Laura and his father stood in Dylan's way, we will probably never know why he killed Tim. Whether out of boredom, audacity, or growing confidence that he could get away with anything, even murder. On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous, and he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, and thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, big, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control, and her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney The police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her, but both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, found and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown, but it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, he blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4th, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had. So she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful Blom, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture, and their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. But they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Delia Bamer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3, not knowing what to do with them. He sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Bamer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police added their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Swine. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence he knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night" in Vienna depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. 2 poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and 2 hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Swine as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly two women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Swinney is too dangerous to ever be released again. Larry Riskin joined the Navy after school, and over the years of service, he achieved the rank of commanding officer in the Navy fleet. He participated in the Persian Gulf War and demonstrated courage and bravery multiple times, but unexpectedly discovered that he was taking orders from a fragile woman. Larry met Sonia Rios at a barbecue. She owned a beauty salon in the city of Lomita, a suburb of Los Angeles. He was immediately attracted to the very beautiful and striking woman, and within a year, Sonia took her husband's family name and became Sonia Riskin. They settled in Sonia's house. Larry was always extremely close to his family, parents, brothers, and especially his younger sister Sherry Jackson. But everything changed with the arrival of Sonia. She did not allow him to see his relatives, inventing various reasons why they couldn't visit them in Washington. The relationship deteriorated to the point that Larry didn't communicate with his sister and brothers for over 10 years. They only heard rumors that he had resigned and found a job as a teacher for children with special needs. His colleagues remember that he loved children and adored his job. However, he confessed that he was unhappy at home. One thing weighed heavily on him. He dreamed of becoming a father. However, Sonia did not want to have children, and being a very beautiful woman, she misled Larry, pretending to be younger than him. In reality, she was 16 years older. Of course, women at that age are still capable of having children, but Larry felt that his chances of fulfilling his dream were diminishing with each passing day. That's why he grasped at the last straw. In Sonia's homeland, the Philippines, he became attached to his wife's brother's grandchildren, Quincy and Jetmark. The parents of the teenagers believed that with Sonia and Larry in the USA, their children would have a better future, so they supported Larry's proposal to adopt them. Sonia did not object, but insisted on taking care of all the legal matters herself. A year passed, 2, 3, but the process of adoption was not progressing. Larry discovered that Sonia was intentionally sabotaging the adoption process. At that moment, it was his last chance to create a complete family, and he was very disappointed. So much so that he demanded a divorce. Sonia agreed, but with one condition. She asked her husband to go to the Philippines and sell her family business, a taxi company, a matter that needed to be resolved immediately. The man agreed, partly because he wanted to see the children, especially since Quincy's 16th birthday was approaching. Surprisingly, Sonia did not go, even though the matter concerned her family and her business. Before his visit to the Philippines, the first in 13 years, Larry visited his relatives in Washington. He was happy to start a new chapter in his life without his wife but with her nephews, whom he still hoped to adopt. Immediately after landing, Larry went to see them. During the birthday party, Larry noticed that the little cousin of the boys had developed an eye infection. He insisted on taking her to the hospital. Someone present made a call to Sonia and informed her that they would be at the hospital. Larry put the girl in the car and, along with Jetmark and a few other adults, they all went to the hospital. After the visit to the doctor, they got back into the Jeep and were about to return home when a motorcycle approached them. One of the two men on the motorcycle started shooting at Larry's head and abdomen. Then the criminals quickly fled the scene. Jack Mark tried to help Larry and called for help. He was confident that they would save him since the hospital was only a few steps away. But the boy was mistaken. They couldn't save Larry. He was 43 years old. When Sonia was informed of her husband's murder, she completely lost control. She was shaking all over and needed help from neighbors Nicole and Jim Thompson to calm her down. Nicole called Larry's sister, Sherry, to inform her about what had happened, but unexpectedly, Sherry started blaming Sonia for everything. Nicole and Jim didn't take her words seriously. Not then. However, the next morning, Sonia asked Jim again to come and help her search for documents. When Jim learned that Sonia was looking for her husband's insurance policy, he refused to help her. While Larry's family was preparing for his funeral, his wife was only interested in the insurance. Moreover, Sonia had no intention of attending the funeral. She arranged for her husband to be cremated, and the urn with his ashes remained in the Philippines with one of her relatives. Larry's relatives saw this as another blow from Sonia, but they still held the funeral and prepared a niche in the mausoleum, where they hoped to someday place the urn with his ashes. They hoped that the Philippine police would solve this case, confident that Larry's wife was behind it all. But at that time, they still didn't know, nor could they have known, that there was another mystery in this story, another man, and another murder. It was news that had the impact of a bomb exploding. Larry Riskin was not Sonia's first husband, and the reason why they were no longer together with her first husband was that he was killed in the Philippines 19 years ago. The man's name was Earl John Bordeaux. Earl's family lived in Davenport, Iowa, in the same house where he grew up. He was the pride of the family. Earl joined the Navy during the Vietnam War, but his unit was stationed in the Philippines, where he met an attractive local girl named Sonia, who sang at a nightclub near their base. It was obviously love at first sight because the young couple quickly got married, and a few months later, Earl brought his young wife home to meet his family. However, the happy reunion did not go well. The girl did not please Earl's family. Therefore, after his departure from the Navy, they settled in Southern California. Several years later, Sonia opened a beauty salon, and her husband found work in a bakery. Outwardly, it seemed like a family filled with love and harmony. But in reality, Sonia enjoyed giving orders to her military husband and controlled him as she pleased. They lived together for more than 20 years when Earl finally realized that such a family life and his wife's commands were burdening him. Sonia agreed to divorce. But before that, and here a strange sense of déjà vu arose, the husband needed to go to the Philippines to sell the family taxi motor company. Earl didn't want to go, but his wife was inflexible on this issue, and the man chose not to argue. He pleaded with his younger brother Dennis to go with him, but he couldn't quickly obtain a passport, so Earl went to the Philippines alone. It was a hot August night when Earl's plane landed in Manila. He arrived at the house where his wife's relatives lived around midnight. The man was exhausted from the journey, fell onto the couch, and fell into a deep sleep until he was truly killed. When the police arrived, they found Earl lying in a pool of his own blood. He had been shot. The officers concluded that a robber had entered the house and Earl had interfered, but there were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen, and the criminal only fired at Earl. 3 men were immediately arrested and charged with the murder. Later, 2 more were detained. They were all members of Sonia's family. Fresh human blood was found on the shirt and pants of one of Sonia's brothers. There was enough evidence to send the culprits to prison for a long time. But then came a surprise. Since Sonia was the closest relative, according to Philippine law, she was supposed to attend a preliminary hearing in court where charges would be brought against her family members. However, since she didn't show up, the charges were dropped and the case was closed. The local authorities claimed their hands were tied, at least officially. Unofficially, the locals gossip that Sonia paid to make all the problems go away. As they explain it, $1,000, and the witnesses would stay silent and the evidence would disappear. Earl's brother, Dennis, felt guilty because he let his brother go alone, so he constantly called a lawyer in the Philippines, spending thousands of dollars on his own investigation, hoping to make Sonia worried. But instead, he became the target himself. He received around 200 threats over the phone, but he didn't calm down. He reported Sonia to the police and the FBI. As a result, he became the target of the killer. It happened once while he was fishing. The shooter missed, but it didn't end there. Later, the attack happened right near his garage. Dennis informed the FBI about everything, but nothing happened. The Bordeaux case was forgotten until, after 10 years, Dennis learned that Sonia had a second husband, and he suffered the same fate as his brother. Dennis hoped that the renewed interest in Sonia could also revive interest in his brother's case. Once learning Sonia's plans to obtain not only all the property but also her husband's insurance, things didn't go as planned. The insurance company hired a private investigator who quickly discovered that fraud was nothing new for Sonia. She had burned down her beauty salon for insurance purposes, manipulated taxes and receipts. She had been caught twice before, so her name was known to the police. The investigator provided his report to the employer, and the insurance company refused to pay Sonia the insurance money. However, the investigator's work impressed Sherry and her family so much that they hired him to investigate the murders. He quickly found out that Earl's and Larry's murders were similar in that the Sony brothers were involved in both crimes. They, like other family members, were financially dependent on Sonia and were willing to do anything she demanded. Sherry, just like Dennis, handed everything the private investigator found to the FBI, hoping that an investigation would finally begin. However, weeks and months passed and nothing changed. Sonia continued working at her salon as usual. But after the new year, Sherry started receiving emails. The author claimed that Sonia was responsible for Larry's murder and offered to return his sister's ashes. The emails were signed by John Bordeaux. How could that be? Bordeaux was the surname of Sonia's first husband, but Earl John Bordeaux had long been dead. It turns out that Sonia had a son whose existence she kept secret. She gave birth to a boy in the Philippines when she was a very young girl, a teenager. Earl adopted the boy after their wedding. Earl's family knew nothing about him, nor did Larry's family, despite Larry's desperate desire to have children. Nevertheless, Sherry decided to respond to the emails, primarily because she wanted to return Larry's ashes. John asked for $35,000 in return, but the more they corresponded, the more Sherry became afraid of what kind of person he might be. What if he was a fraud or something worse? With each new letter, she realized that he was indeed worse. For an additional fee, he offered another service to kill Sonia, whom Sherry despised. Sherry was frightened, not knowing how to escape this situation and fearing what else might happen. Her fears were not unfounded. On April 27, 2007, in Lamita, the 60-year-old owner of a beauty salon was found murdered. She had been shot, and the killing resembled an execution rather than a random shooting. The victim was Sonia Riskin, known as the Black Widow of Lamita, who was suspected of killing not one, but two husbands. She met the same fate as her victims. The arriving police were struck by the meticulous and well-kept nature of the house. It appeared that the owner rarely received visitors during her lifetime, which perfectly matched her character as a reclusive and suspicious woman. It was also interesting to note that there were no signs of forced entry. It seemed that the killer simply entered the house and shot his victim. Her purse remained untouched, along with the cash inside. The neighbors saw nothing. The victim's relatives immediately rushed to the scene, among them her beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Sonia regarded him as her favorite grandson and was proud of him. The young man served on the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier and had just returned home after a tour of Asia. Upon hearing that his beloved aunt had been killed, He immediately informed the police that if something happened to Sonia, John Bordeaux was responsible for it all. John Bordeaux didn't have to be searched for, as he was the one who found Sonia's body and contacted the rescue service. The detectives immediately found the relationship between the son and Mother strange. There wasn't a single photograph of him in the house, no hint of a son, as if he didn't exist for Sonia. Overall, he seemed like the family outcast, especially compared to Sonia's favorite, Eric. John explained that although he and his mother sometimes couldn't find common ground and didn't communicate, the situation had improved recently, and he would never harm her. When asked who he believed could have committed the murder, he could only mention Sherry, Larry's sister. After all, she genuinely hated Sonia, as did Dennis. The FBI questioned both of them, but they had alibis. Moreover, no one was as devastated by Sonia's death as these two. They hoped Sonia would pay for her terrible actions by going to prison, so the detectives turned their attention back to John. The electronic emails signed with his name didn't work in his favor. Furthermore, he failed the polygraph test. Even his own relatives considered him the murderer. Allegedly, no one else had the motive, opportunity, and means to commit the crime, but he insisted on his innocence and stood his ground. Therefore, the detectives didn't rush to arrest him, and they were rewarded with a clue from the Black Widow herself. A few days before Sonia's death, she contacted the police to report two strange incidents at her beauty salon. The first time, a young man appeared at her hairdressing salon wanting a haircut. He called her from the parking lot, and Sonia saw him through the window. She became suspicious because he had a short, military-style haircut. It was clear he didn't need a haircut, so she told him that she only served regular clients, which he wasn't. It seemed like the incident was resolved, but 2 days later, the same guy returned to the salon and this time acted more aggressively. He opened fire on Sonia, causing her to panic and call the police. She informed the officers that she didn't know the shooter, but she remembered he had called her 2 days ago. The cautious woman recorded his number. It belonged to a certain Fernando Romero. Romero himself had disappeared, but the detectives only needed a warrant to access the history of his calls. They expected the phone to lead them to John Bordeaux, but no, his number wasn't listed. Instead, they found the number of someone they knew well. A person who had communicated with Fernando not once or twice, but frequently, especially in the hours before and after the murder. The number belonged to Sonia's beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Further on, after a week, the news reached the FBI. Specialists were investigating the IP addresses from which the supposed letters from John Bordeaux were sent. All of them led to Asia, Hong Kong, Korea. These addresses belonged to naval bases. The FBI employees knew that Eric and Romero were two sailors who served on an aircraft carrier. It was likely that they knew each other. Could these young individuals have planned the murder while being on an American military ship? The FBI investigated the location of the ship during the time the emails were sent. It was in ports in Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea at the same time the letters were sent. However, sending letters is one thing, but why would Eric kill a woman who cared for him better than his own son? Sonia was killed late in the evening on Friday, and on Monday morning, even before the office opened, Eric was already waiting for her lawyer. He wanted to know how much money he would inherit from his beloved aunt. However, Sonia had another card hidden up her sleeve. Eric didn't receive a cent. All her money, homes, cars, absolutely all of Sonia's belongings were left to her son, Jean Bordeaux. But the young man had another harsh blow awaiting him. It turned out that all this time, while he believed he was the main suspect of the police, Jean Bordeaux was being misled. And when the investigators simply presented him with a photograph of Fernando Romero, Eric lost his ability to speak. Choking on surprise and stumbling over his words, he blurted out that he had conducted his own investigation and Fernando had nothing to do with it. He must have realized that Fernando was the thread leading the investigation back to himself. Both young individuals were arrested and charged with the murder of Sonia Riskin. The police apologized to John for pressuring him. He was still frightened after what he had to endure, but he understood that the detectives were just doing their job. In February 2011, the trial began. Fernando and Eric were tried together. The prosecution faced a difficult task. The victim of the murder herself was suspected of orchestrating the killings of two husbands. The accused, the young sailors, could elicit sympathy and comparison. The prosecutor decided to be honest with the jury. He portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer deserving punishment, but now it was necessary to punish the defendants who not only killed a woman but also attempted to frame her son. It worked. The jury found the two guilty. They were sentenced to imprisonment ranging from 26 years to life. It was an astonishing family. They eliminated anyone in their path of financial gain. Sonia and her brothers killed Earl. Sonia and her brothers killed Larry. And Eric killed his beloved aunt. How many murders can there be in one family if it's not a Game of Thrones? The irony lies in the fact that Sonia killed two people who did nothing wrong and were always kind to her. Eric killed a person who had always been kind to him for the sake of money he never received. The Black Widow of Lamata truly reaped what she sowed. In 2019, Sherry went to the Philippines to personally try to find Larry's remains. She could only ascertain that the remains were passed from one relative to another under Eric's orders. In the end, her search led her to a house that had obviously been vacant for a long time. She couldn't fulfill her dream of returning with her brother's urn to their homeland. November 4th, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Fotopoulos family's house. In the bedroom on the second floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Fotopoulos, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the second floor. 26-year-old Lisa Fotopoulos was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber, saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the first floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Costa Fotopoulos grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him, a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business, a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her, her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, it was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Deidre Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Deidre turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Deidre was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, he became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, The girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deidre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deidre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deidre 2 blocks away from her work so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, the bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening for some unknown reason. Furthermore, she recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Fotopoulos' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Fotopoulos' bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the Fotopoulos house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt, but if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet. Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at CoStar's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering, but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, they asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The poor boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him, but that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and the .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Fotopoulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during Kostar's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under Kostar's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, the judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her. For 17 years, even the youngest residents of the French commune of Germain couldn't truly enjoy life due to the pervasive fear that gripped their families. Local resident Manon lives near the former home of the grieving family, and her parents told her about what happened when she was still a child. We walk the same streets, so, of course, we are afraid that someone might attack or abduct us, the girl says. My father always accompanied me, and now we finally know what he did, and he confessed to everything. That is somewhat comforting. For 17 whole years, it was impossible to see a child walking alone on the street. On January 9, 2003, 9-year-old Estelle Mouzin disappeared while returning home from school in her hometown of Germain, in the department of Seine-et-Marne near Paris. The girl lived with her mother Suzanne Mouzin, who was in the process of divorcing her husband and Estelle's father, Eric Mouzin. The father lived in the commune of Le Vessinet with her older brother Arthur, approximately 60 kilometers away from her mother's home. When Suzanne returned home from work at 7:30 p.m. and realized that her daughter was not there, she reported the child's disappearance to the police. In July 2003, the police began to suspect that serial killer Michel Fourniret might be involved in Estelle's disappearance because he had confessed to killing 7 people, including 3 young girls. Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier appeared to be ordinary French retirees, he with his glasses and well-groomed hands in a professorial pose, and she, with her sunken cheeks, resembled a typical grandmother looking after her grandchildren. Behind this facade, however, lay one of France's most dangerous sexual predators, who committed his murders with the active involvement of his wife and faithful accomplice. This grey-haired couple stood alongside the most horrifying criminals in the country's history. Using her image as a happily married, respectable wife, Olivier instilled confidence in the girls that they had nothing to fear, while the poor victims were about to become the next prey of the killers. Once the girls were kidnapped, bound, and sometimes drugged, Olivier would inspect them, checking whether they were virgins, which her husband desired. The couple met after Reay was arrested in 1984 for sexual crimes in the Paris area and placed an advertisement in a newspaper seeking a pen pal. Michelle and Monique corresponded for a long time, and then, as it turned out, Reay proposed to Olivier, a former caregiver, to get rid of her two ex-husbands who, according to Monique, had mistreated her. In exchange, she promised to find young girls for him. Reay never fulfilled his promise, but 2 months after his release in 1987, Olivier did what she called her first offering to her beast. Isabelle Laville was a shy 17-year-old girl who was seeing a therapist. Olivier said she chose her because she reminded her of her young self but was still an innocent girl that her husband desired. Olivier drove up to Isabelle in her car and asked for directions, convincing the girl to get in the car and show her the way. A little further down the road, Reay was waiting for them, pretending to be a motorist who needed help because his car broke down. Olivier stopped and allowed the man to get in. As they continued on their way, Reay, sitting in the back seat, strangled the girl and announced that she was now their captive. On the way back to their home, they drugged Isabelle too much. At home, Reay found himself unable to assault the girl, so he had sex with Monique instead, and then he killed Isabelle by strangling her. In 2006, he led the police to her remains, which were dumped in an old well. Olivier claimed she didn't know that Reay would kill the girl. Whatever the case, the incident seemed to solidify the relationship between the couple. In 1988, while pregnant, Olivier asked 20-year-old student Fabienne Leroy for help, saying she urgently needed to see a doctor. The sympathetic girl got into the car, and this time, Reay was behind the wheel. He drove the car into a field and forced the victim to get out at gunpoint. After Olivier checked the girl's virginity, Reay assaulted and killed Fabienne. Her body was found in a field the next day, and the couple continued to find victims and kill them following their established pattern. When their son Salem was born, the criminals didn't hesitate to use him as bait, telling girls they needed a doctor for the baby. Even if Olivier didn't always accompany her husband on his trips, he would always tell her about his exploits, claiming that he went hunting or saying, "I found satisfaction." In 2003, Reay made a mistake. A 13-year-old girl he abducted in Belgium managed to escape from his van when he stopped at a gas station. She chewed through the rope he used to tie her wrists. The girl was picked up by a passing motorist who noted down the van's license plate number. Reay was arrested, and in his car they found several hairs, one of which belonged to Manania Thumpong, a 13-year-old girl whose remains were found in a forest in 2001. Reay was not eager to cooperate with the investigation, but the police from at least 5 countries, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, began reviewing cases of violence, abductions, and murders that remained unsolved and resembled Reay's crimes. In Denmark, the police noticed that the composite sketch of a suspect in a violent crime closely resembled Reay, while in the Netherlands, Reay started to be suspected in the disappearance of 2 girls. In 2004, the criminal finally confessed to kidnapping and killing victims during the 1980s and 1990s, admitting to abducting 9 girls and young women during that time. He is also suspected of 10 more murders, 9 in France and 1 in Belgium. In 2006, rumors circulated that Reay might be the true culprit in the case of Christian Ranucci. Christian, a 20-year-old man, was beheaded by the guillotine in France on July 28, 1976, after being suspected of killing 8-year-old Marie Dolores Rambler. This case had always been highly controversial. On June 3, 1974, Marie Dolores and her brother Jean met a young man driving a car, wearing a red sweater, who claimed he was looking for his lost dog. The man had asked the children to help him, and Jean ran to search for the dog, while Marie Dolores got into the man's car and was abducted. An hour after the girl's disappearance, Christian's car, a grey Peugeot 304, was involved in an accident and left the scene. Witnesses described the driver's appearance to the police, who immediately concluded a connection between the abduction and the fleeing motorist. After a search, Marie Dolores' body was found in the bushes, where she had been strangled to death. Ranucci was arrested due to the car accident and the fact that he was allegedly carrying a heavy package. Police found trousers with dried blood stains in his car, and the blood group on the trousers matched the girl's blood group. At first, Ranucci confessed to the murder and told the police where he had hidden the knife in the bushes. What was strange about this confession was that he only confessed to facts that the police had already established in the first 48 hours of the investigation. A day later, Ranucci denied his involvement in the crime. Allegedly, Ranucci's case was adjusted and physical evidence was hidden to match his confession. The bloodstains on the trousers turned out to be much older and were merely the result of the man falling off a motorcycle. Moreover, Ranucci had the same blood group as the girl. An elderly couple who witnessed the incident claimed to have seen the girl on the backseat of Ranucci's car and heard her screaming. However, the credibility of this statement is questionable since the couple did not leave their own car, and the door of Ranucci's car was broken from the side opposite to where the pensioners claimed he had taken the girl out. Later, 5 more people claimed to have witnessed the abduction, and all of them described a man who looked nothing like Ranucci. 2 interesting points are worth noting. Firstly, Fourniret also drove a grey Peugeot 304, which from behind resembled a Simca 1100, a car described by 2 witnesses as the one the driver used to lure children inside on the day of Marie Dolores' abduction. The driver was wearing a red sweater, which was later found by investigators. As it turned out, the sweater found at the crime scene did not belong to Ranucci, as several sizes too small for an athletic-looking young man like him. Secondly, the most surprising discovery was a photograph taken by a photographer from a Marseille newspaper in March 1976 in the courtroom during Ranucci's trial. Among the visitors, there sat a man with glasses who suspiciously resembled Fourniret. Although the fact that Fourniret attended the trial was refuted, it is hard to deny that he is a much more suitable suspect in this case. For example, he went on vacation to Marseille in June 1974, driving a car of the same grey colour and brand. At that time, he was 32 years old and, compared to Ranucci, already had a history of sexual crimes. Fourniret also frequently used the lost dog trick to lure young girls into his car. Additionally, no signs of violence were found on the child's body. Unfortunately for Ranucci, the media frenzy around the girl's murder made him a suspect even before the case went to trial. Immediately after his arrest, the press labeled him as the killer, and he was sentenced to death, becoming one of the last people executed in France. Why did the police begin to suspect that Michel Fourniret might be connected to the disappearance of Estelle Mouzin? 2 weeks before Estelle's disappearance, a 9-year-old girl was almost kidnapped by a man in a white van. The girl was able to describe the driver to the police, which led to the creation of a composite sketch of the suspect. When the police focused their efforts on Fourniret, who also drove a white van, they showed the girl a photo of him, hoping she would recognize him, but she didn't. Additionally, after his confession to the murders, Fourniret led the police to the burial site of one of his young victims. On the way there, he described the clothing the girl was wearing on the day of her abduction, which was similar to what Estelle was wearing on the day she disappeared, although the police believe this might be a mere coincidence. Sometime later, the police found photos of Estelle and recordings of television programs about the girl in Fourniret's house and on his computer. It's worth noting that 2 fragments of white shoelaces and black gloves were found with Fourniret, and Estelle was wearing white shoes and black gloves on the day of her disappearance. However, the police couldn't find any additional connections between the serial killer and the crime, and the hypothesis of Fourniret's involvement had to be discarded due to a lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. He claimed he made a phone call to his son from his home on the day the girl disappeared. Although there was no certainty that Fourniret actually made that call, the police believed he was not lying. Psychologists were also confident that Fourniret was not involved in the case because Estelle was too young for him. The 3 girls he confessed to murdering were 12 and 13 years old. His accomplice and wife, Monique Olivier, told the police that once when they were watching a TV program accusing Fourniret of killing Estelle, he laughed and said it wasn't him. In May 2010, the Mouzin family's lawyer requested a new investigation into Fourniret's involvement. In 2013, he was declared innocent after several hair analyses from his van, conducted when he was arrested in 2003, did not match Estelle's DNA. As for the second suspect in Estelle Mouzin's kidnapping, Nordal Lelandaise, the police were interested in him in connection with 3 different crimes. He was the main suspect in the murder of Arthur Noyer, a soldier who disappeared in April and whose skull was found in September. He was also the main suspect in the case of the disappearance of Maëlys de Araujo, a 9-year-old girl who was kidnapped from a wedding on August 27, 2017. 9-year-old Maëlys de Araujo was last seen on the night of August 27, 2017, at a wedding to which she was invited with her parents. At the event, the children were playing separately from the adult celebration. Around 3 a.m., her absence was noticed, and her search began initially without police involvement. A witness at the wedding recalled, the DJ of the evening announced over the microphone that a child was missing. Suddenly everyone started searching in the main hall and outside. It was terrible. To witness the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl, it's very serious. At first, we thought she fell asleep somewhere after playing hide and seek. An hour later, when she wasn't found, the police were called. The arriving police initiated the search for the child using search dogs and also explored the area with helicopters. All 180 guests invited to the wedding were interviewed. Almost immediately, investigators noticed inconsistencies in the statements of Nordal Lelandaise, a friend of the groom. A week into the investigation, after crime scene analysts found DNA belonging to the girl on the dashboard of Lelandaise's car, he was charged with her kidnapping. From that moment, Lelandaise remained silent, refusing to assist the investigation, and claimed that even though the girl might have been in his car, it didn't prove his guilt. As the police conducted their investigation into the child's disappearance, they discovered other clues pointing to Lelandaise's involvement. In particular, a surveillance camera captured a car belonging to the man leaving the wedding venue with a small figure on the passenger seat shortly before the girl's disappearance was reported. The blurry silhouette was wearing a white dress, similar to what Maëlys was wearing. The parents recognized elements of the dress, especially the child's ribbon, said their lawyer, Fabien Rajon. Additionally, Lelandaise's phone was in airplane mode around the time of the girl's disappearance, and it turned back on 39 minutes later when he returned to the celebration alone. It was also established that the next day, Lelandaise spent several hours cleaning his car with powerful cleaning products. He claimed he did it to prepare the car for sale. Lelandaise's defense initially disputed the timeline provided by the prosecution. His lawyer confirmed that while traces of the girl's DNA were found on his car's dashboard, his client completely denied kidnapping her. He stated that several DNA traces were found on the dashboard, and someone who had contact with the child could have transferred her DNA into the car. He also speculated that children could have gotten into the car without the driver's knowledge, noting that the windows were opened during the celebration. After 6 months of investigation, Lelandaise was forced to change his statements when Maëlys's blood was found in the trunk of his car. He confessed to killing the girl and apologized to her parents. Earlier, he had admitted that she was in his car on the night of her disappearance but claimed not to know anything about her subsequent fate. Now, he admitted that he unintentionally killed the child. The prosecutor from Grenoble, Jean-Yves Coquelet, stated that Lelandaise led investigators to the location near his parents' home in Domessine, Savoie Department, where the body was found. The search for the remains of the young girl took an entire day and was complicated by snow and rough terrain. Some of the girl's remains were found by the investigators and search dogs. The prosecutor from Grenoble said that Maëlys's parents are no longer in the dark, adding that they know their daughter is dead, that she was killed, and that a few minutes ago, they were told that the child's remains were found. This is a horrific conclusion to the case, the culmination of 6 months of investigation and search, he added. The girl's mother addressed Leland Days through a Facebook message. We had to wait 5.5 months for this monster to finally speak. Mayleys will haunt you day and night in your cell, she wrote, grieving. My little angel, I couldn't protect you from this predator, and I will blame myself for that for a long time. Nordal Leland Days, a former military dog handler who was also charged with the murder of a young soldier, claims that he killed Mayleys do Araujo by mistake but refused to provide details of what happened. Post-mortem examination showed that the girl had a broken jaw, likely from a strong blow to the face. The prosecutors handling Mayleys' case suspect Leland Days to be a serial killer. On December 21, 2017, he was charged with the murder of Arthur Noye, a 23-year-old soldier who disappeared without a trace during a hike on April 12, 2017. The soldier's relatives admitted that they also hoped to learn the truth about his death. Arthur was last seen early in the morning on April 12, 2017, as he left a nightclub to go on a hike in Chambéry. Pieces of his skull were found on a hiking trail in the municipality of Montmelian, near Chambéry, in September. The phone company recorded Leland Days' phone in the same area at the time of the soldier's disappearance. Leland Days' Audi A3 was also spotted by surveillance cameras in the Chambéry area. During the investigation, police also searched his computer and phone, and it was revealed that 2 weeks after the soldier's disappearance, Leland Days entered the search query human body dismemberment. Over time, Leland Days confessed to investigators that he gave the soldier a ride but denied any involvement in his death before finally admitting to the murder on March 29, 2018. There are also suspicions that Leland Days may be responsible for the unsolved murder of 3 people in the Alps when a British man, his wife, and his mother-in-law were killed in a car park in a wooded area in September 2012. Other cases in which Leland Days may be involved include the disappearance of Adrian Murel, a 24-year-old Belgian man who went missing near Lake Annecy in July, and Jean-Christophe Morin and Ahmed Hamad, who disappeared in 2011 and 2012, respectively. Leland Days' alleged connections to these murders led the police to start reviewing other cases of missing people in the region as they feared he might be a serial killer. The police investigated his possible involvement in at least 10 other crimes. While investigating other potential crimes, Leland Days' connection to the case of Estelle Mouzin came to light. Mayleys' disappearance bore similarities to Estelle's case, as the girls were about the same age, and both vanished without a trace, with no witnesses to the abductions. Recognizing this similarity, Estelle's family requested to determine Leland Days' whereabouts at the time of their daughter's disappearance. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, it turned out that he was serving in the military in the Marne department, 150 kilometers away from where Estelle disappeared. Thus, law enforcement had to dismiss him as a second prospective suspect in Estelle Mouzin's abduction case. Over the course of several years while the search for Estelle was ongoing, other potential leads were discovered, which ultimately led nowhere. For instance, a real shock for the girl's family was the appearance of a photo allegedly of Estelle, which was taken from a website containing indecent images of children. Her father confessed how upset he was by the appearance of such a photo, but it turned out not to be his daughter. The girl in the photo appeared older than Estelle, and the image was taken several years before her disappearance. The police had no new leads, and the chances of finding Estelle were diminishing before their eyes. But then thunder struck on January 24, 2020, when Monique Olivier, the former wife of Michel Fourniret, claimed that her ex-husband killed Estelle Mouzin. On March 6, 2020, her statements were confirmed by Michel Fourniret himself. For years, Michel Fourniret denied any involvement in the girl's disappearance. However, 16.5 years later, on November 27, 2019, Michel Fourniret, a serial killer and predator of minors who was already serving a life sentence, became the primary suspect once again. He was charged with abduction and forced confinement, which ended in death. On January 24, 2020, Monique Olivier confirmed to Judge Sabine Keris that it was indeed her who made the phone call from their home to Tami Reay's son on January 9, 2003, the day of the girl's disappearance. Not stopping there, she continued to narrate that the girl represented the type of victim her husband was seeking, and she was not too young for him, as psychologists once claimed. She admitted that a few days before the abduction, her husband had been driving around the region and returned one evening, announcing that he had spotted a beautiful little target, as he put it. Responding to questions from the investigating judge after his alibi collapsed due to his former wife's confession, Tami Reay finally confirmed that he abducted and killed the girl. However, the elderly Tami Reay claimed during the hearing that he suffers from memory loss and was not formally charged. "It is very likely, even very, very likely, that I was the author of that disappearance," Tami Reay said, asserting that nothing clicked in his head when he was shown a picture of the girl. "Since I cannot say for sure that I am responsible for her disappearance, I call on you to consider me as guilty," he added. Tami Reay, 78 years old according to media reports, is suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, experiencing moments of absence, but is generally understood everything, according to Didier Sabin, the lawyer of Estelle's father. To corroborate Tami Reay's statements, Monique Olivier was questioned again, and she confirmed that her husband did indeed abduct and kill Estelle Mouzin. Although Tami Reay confessed to the girl's murder, he refused or was unable to reveal the location where he hid her body. He only mentioned that she might be on the property of one of his houses in the Ardennes. Forensics began the grim search for the girl's remains on Monday, June 22, 2020. Experts sealed off Tami Reay's former home in northern France, more than 200 kilometers from where Estelle was abducted on her way home from school. The police also cordoned off another former residence of Tami Reay in Château de Sautou, where the remains of other victims of the killer, a 12-year-old girl and a 22-year-old woman, were found in 2004. Unfortunately, they did not find Estelle's body. "We can report some progress, but some doors have been closed forever, places we can now discard," said one of the lawyers representing the Mouzin family. Even before Tami Reay's confession to Estelle's murder, the serial killer, nicknamed the Monster of the Ardennes, as well as the Virginity Hunter, had been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His accomplice, Monique Olivier, also received a life sentence with the possibility of parole only after 28 years. Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life, not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear of the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Pena, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa, drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertman woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Pena family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Pena family home. They did just that. Randy Ertman and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Pena family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Pena. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, the families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house. He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertman was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medine, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medine, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul the Ariel. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless. After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medine and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl, where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medine watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry. She was more in anger. However, seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medine watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girls' shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Cantu always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse. It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, she told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venanzio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venanzio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Pena believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughters torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor? Do you want him living next to you?" Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Ertman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities.